On a bitter January morning in 1957, the small bell above the door of Goldstein's Fine Tailoring chimed softly as a well-dressed man stepped inside from the frozen streets of Manhattan. Samuel Goldstein looked up from his work table, where he had been meticulously hand-stitching the collar of a navy wool overcoat, his reading glasses perched low on his nose. The winter sunlight filtering through the shop's front windows, casting long shadows across bolts of fabric stacked neatly along the walls. The customer appeared unremarkable at first glance, a middle-aged gentleman in a charcoal suit with a crisp white shirt and burgundy tie, the kind of professional man Samuel had served countless times in his 30 years on Madison Avenue. His face was clean-shaven and slightly weathered, with the kind of careful grooming that suggested attention to appearance without vanity. What neither man could have imagined in that moment was that this seemingly routine visit would unravel one of the most sophisticated Soviet intelligence networks operating on American soil, all because of something as insignificant as a single button. Samuel Goldstein had escaped Vienna in 1938 with little more than his sewing kit and the clothes on his back, watching his beloved city disappear behind him as the train carried him toward an uncertain future through the darkness of a continent descending into madness. The journey had been terrifying, each border crossing bringing new fears of discovery, new questions from suspicious officials examining papers that Samuel prayed would hold up under scrutiny. He remembered the weight of his father's pocket watch in his coat, the only family heirloom he had managed to save, feeling it press against his chest like a reminder of everything he was leaving behind. His father had been a master tailor, as had his grandfather before him, and Samuel had learned the craft in their workshop on a quiet street near the Stephansdom, where the family had served Vienna's professional class for 3 generations. Now, nearly 2 decades later, his small shop on Madison Avenue had become a sanctuary, not just for fine garments, but for the skills he had honed over decades of careful observation, skills that the war and its aftermath had sharpened into something far more valuable than anyone realized. The faded sign above his door read, "Goldstein's Fine Tailoring," in gold letters on a dark green background, dignified and understated, exactly as Samuel preferred things to be. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. The man who entered that morning introduced himself as Robert Thompson, a businessman from Chicago visiting New York for meetings with potential investors. His voice carried the flat vowels of the Midwest, pronouncing his words with that characteristic lack of inflection that marked the Central States, though Samuel, with his trained ear for accents refined by decades of listening to customers from across America and the world, detected something slightly off in the rhythm, a microscopic hesitation before certain words that a native speaker would never have. Thompson's handshake was firm and confident, not the aggressive bone crusher of someone trying too hard, but rather the practiced grip of a man comfortable in professional settings. He explained that he needed 2 suits tailored, one for an important dinner at the Waldorf Astoria and another for daily business wear. His eyes, a pale grey blue, moved around the shop with what appeared to be casual interest, taking in the wooden measuring sticks hanging on the wall, the vintage tailor's dummy standing in the corner wearing a half-finished vest, the framed certificates from the Vienna Tailors Guild that Samuel had managed to save from his old life. Samuel nodded pleasantly, pulling out his measuring tape and notepad, beginning the familiar ritual he had performed thousands of times, a dance of measurements and questions that he could have done in his sleep. Thompson removed his overcoat and jacket, draping them carefully over the leather chair near the window that overlooked Madison Avenue, where pedestrians hurried past against the January cold, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Samuel began taking measurements with practiced efficiency, the tape sliding around Thompson's shoulders, down his arms across his chest and waist. His hands moved with the automatic precision of long experience, calling out numbers that he jotted down in the small leather notebook he had carried since his Vienna days, its pages yellowed and soft with age, filled with the measurements of hundreds of customers. Thompson stood patiently, arms extended when needed, turning when directed, the model customer who understood the process and didn't fidget or complain. As Samuel worked, Measuring shoulders and inseam, sleeve length and chest, he engaged in the pleasant small talk that customers expected. Thompson spoke easily about the weather, about the challenges of business travel, about his admiration for New York's energy. Nothing about the conversation raised any concerns. Samuel had developed an instinct over the years for reading his customers, the nervous groom before his wedding, the executive trying to project confidence he didn't feel, the wealthy man who demanded perfection in every stitch. Thompson seemed comfortable, assured, exactly what one would expect from a successful businessman. It was when Samuel began examining Thompson's jacket more closely, checking the style and fit to understand his preferences for the new suits he would create, that something caught his eye. The fabric itself was excellent, a fine charcoal wool with a subtle herringbone weave that spoke of quality manufacturing. The buttons on the jacket were of excellent quality as well, genuine horn with a subtle mottling that spoke of European craftsmanship, each one carefully selected to match the others in size and tone, the kind of attention to detail that Samuel appreciated as a fellow craftsman. But it wasn't the buttons themselves that made Samuel pause, his fingers freezing mid-motion as he held the lapel up to the light. It was the way they were attached. Each button had been sewn on with thread forming two parallel lines, running vertically side by side, neat and professional, but distinctly different from what Samuel saw on every American suit that came through his shop. Rather than the crisscross pattern that had been standard in American tailoring for generations, creating an X shape that secured the button firmly and evenly, these buttons were attached with the continental method, two vertical lines of stitching that Samuel knew intimately from his Vienna training. Samuel's fingers traced the stitching almost unconsciously, his mind suddenly sharp and focused, the casual atmosphere of the fitting room taking on a different quality. His pulse quickened slightly, though he was careful to keep his face neutral, his expression merely that of a tailor assessing the quality of a garment. The parallel stitching was distinctly continental, specifically French or Eastern European, the method that had been taught in the great tailoring houses of Paris, Vienna, Budapest and Prague for centuries. Samuel knew this because he had been trained in Vienna, where such techniques were as natural as breathing, passed down from master to apprentice in an unbroken chain going back generations. When he had arrived in America as a refugee in 1939, one of the first adjustments he had made to his craft was learning the American method of button attachment, the crisscross pattern that his new customers expected, without even knowing they expected it. It had felt strange at first, almost wrong, his fingers wanting to fall into the old pattern, but he had forced himself to adapt because fitting in, becoming truly American, meant paying attention to even the smallest details. It was a small detail, one that 99 out of 100 people would never notice or think twice about if they did, but to someone with Samuel's background and training, someone who had spent thousands of hours studying the minute differences between tailoring traditions, it stood out like a beacon flashing in the darkness. He continued his work, giving no indication that he had noticed anything unusual, but his mind was racing. A man claiming to be from Chicago wearing a suit with European-style button stitching, could it be innocent? Perhaps Thompson had purchased the suit abroad, or perhaps he had visited a tailor with continental training, similar to Samuel himself. Samuel carefully set down his measuring tape and moved to examine the jacket more thoroughly under the pretense of checking the fabric quality and condition. He turned the garment inside out, studying the lining and seams with the critical eye of a master craftsman. What he found made his heart beat faster. The interior seams were finished with French seams, a technique where the raw edges of fabric are completely encased in a double-folded stitch. This was far more time-consuming than the standard American flat-felled seam and was rarely used in mass-produced American garments. Moreover, the lining itself had a texture and weave that Samuel recognized from his European training. The thread gauge was slightly finer than what American manufacturers typically used, and the stitching density was higher, tighter, more meticulous. Then he noticed the label. It read, Davidson & Sons, Chicago, printed in a typeface that looked appropriately American. But when Samuel looked more closely, he could see that the label had been sewn in somewhat crudely, the stitches larger and less regular than the rest of the garment's impeccable construction. It appeared to have been added after the fact, transplanted from another garment or created specifically to disguise the suit's true origin. Samuel's throat went dry. He had read enough in the newspapers about the Cold War, about Soviet espionage, about the need for vigilance. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had made it clear that American citizens should report suspicious activity. But was this truly suspicious, or was he allowing his imagination to run wild? Samuel forced himself to remain calm, to continue the fitting as though nothing were amiss. He made notes about Thompson's preferences, discussing fabric weights and lapel widths, pocket styles and trouser pleats. Thompson seemed relaxed, occasionally glancing at his wristwatch, a nice piece but not ostentatious. Samuel suggested several fabric options from his stock, holding up swatches of fine wool gabardine and herringbone tweed. Thompson selected a dark navy worsted for the dinner suit and a grey Glen plaid for the business suit, demonstrating what appeared to be good taste and an understanding of appropriate formal wear. As they discussed details, Samuel noticed other small things that began to accumulate in his mind, like evidence in a trial. Thompson's shoes, while well-polished, had a slightly different shape to the toe than American shoes, more rounded and less pointed. The leather itself had a particular grain that Samuel associated with European tanneries. Thompson's wristwatch, upon closer inspection, had Cyrillic numerals on the dial, barely visible unless one looked carefully. When Samuel asked casually about it, Thompson explained smoothly that it had been a gift from a Russian business contact, a memento from before the war. The explanation was plausible, reasonable even, but it added to the growing constellation of details that didn't quite fit. Samuel completed the measurements and told Thompson that the suits would be ready for a first fitting in 2 weeks. Thompson paid a deposit in cash, crisp bills that he pulled from a money clip, and shook Samuel's hand warmly before departing. The bell above the door chimed again as Thompson stepped out into the cold January afternoon, and Samuel stood alone in his shop, his mind churning with uncertainty and apprehension. For 3 days Samuel struggled with what to do. He was a naturalized American citizen, grateful for the opportunity this country had given him to rebuild his life after the horrors he had witnessed in Europe. But he was also a practical man who understood that making false accusations could destroy an innocent person's reputation and potentially ruin his own business. What if Thompson was simply an American businessman who happened to prefer European tailoring? What if the continental stitching had been done by another tailor with European training, someone like Samuel himself? The thought kept him awake at night, staring at the ceiling of his small apartment above the shop, listening to the sounds of the city that never slept. On the 4th day, Samuel made his decision. He walked to the public telephone booth on the corner and, with trembling fingers, dialed the number he had copied from a Federal Bureau of Investigation poster he had seen at the post office. The number connected him to the New York field office, and he asked to speak with someone about a matter of potential national security. The operator transferred him without hesitation, and a moment later a crisp male voice came on the line, identifying himself as Special Agent William Harrison. Samuel explained his situation carefully, trying to present the facts without sounding paranoid or hysterical. He described Thompson's visit, the button stitching, the French seams, the transplanted label, the European shoes, the watch with Cyrillic numerals. Harrison listened without interrupting, and when Samuel finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Harrison asked Samuel if Thompson had scheduled a return appointment. Samuel confirmed that Thompson was due back in 10 days for the first fitting. Harrison's voice became more animated, more intense. He asked Samuel if he would be willing to cooperate with an investigation, to act naturally when Thompson returned, to help the Bureau gather more information. Samuel felt a cold knot of fear form in his stomach. This was no longer a simple matter of reporting suspicions and walking away. Harrison was asking him to become involved, to potentially place himself in danger. But the memories of Vienna, of the Nazi occupation, of the friends and family he had lost, steeled his resolve. He had escaped one totalitarian regime. He would not stand idly by while another tried to infiltrate his adopted homeland. He told Harrison he would cooperate fully. Over the following week, Samuel received visits from Harrison and another agent named Thomas Mueller, a younger man with sharp features and wire-rimmed glasses, who took copious notes in a small black notebook. They came after hours, always after 7 in the evening when the shop was closed and the street outside had quieted, entering through the back alley door that Samuel unlocked for them, glancing nervously up and down the dark passage before letting them inside. The back room of the shop, normally used for storing fabric and supplies, became an impromptu command post, where the 3 men huddled over a small table, speaking in low voices, even though there was no one to overhear them. Harrison brought photographs, surveillance reports, and maps of Manhattan marked with locations that meant nothing to Samuel, but clearly held significance for the investigation. The agents explained that Samuel's observations were more significant than he had realized, more important than even his most anxious imaginings had suggested. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had been tracking several suspected Soviet intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover in New York for months, watching them meet with contacts, monitoring their movements, trying to identify their networks. But diplomats had immunity, legal protection that made them essentially untouchable. They could be expelled, declared persona non grata, and sent home in embarrassment, but they could not be arrested or prosecuted. More importantly, exposing one diplomat simply meant the Soviets would send another to take their place, and the new officer would be more careful, harder to track. What the Bureau needed were the illegals, the Soviet agents living under false identities without diplomatic protection, embedded deep in American society like splinters under the skin. These were the dangerous ones, the patient ones, the ones who could operate for years without detection, slowly building networks and gathering intelligence. Thompson, if he was indeed a Soviet agent, as the mounting evidence suggested, represented a potentially crucial lead, a thread that might unravel an entire tapestry of espionage. The button stitching and tailoring details that Samuel had noticed were exactly the kind of tradecraft mistakes that the Bureau looked for, small cultural tells that even well-trained agents sometimes overlooked in their attempts to blend into American society. Harrison pulled out a file folder and opened it on the table, showing Samuel photographs of suits, close-up images of buttons and seams and labels. These were teaching materials, he explained, examples of the differences between Soviet and American garment construction that the Bureau had documented over years of investigation. Samuel found himself looking at images that illustrated exactly what he had seen on Thompson's jacket: the parallel button stitching, the French seams, the subtle differences in thread weight and stitching density that marked a garment as foreign, despite any labels or documentation that claimed otherwise. Harrison explained that the Soviet intelligence services, particularly the Committee for State Security, known as the KGB, trained their agents extensively in American customs, speech patterns, and behaviors, spending months or even years preparing operatives for deployment to the United States. The training was comprehensive, covering everything from how Americans walked and gestured to regional variations in vocabulary and pronunciation. Agents studied American history, geography, sports, and popular culture until they could discuss baseball statistics or television programs with apparently genuine enthusiasm. They learned to tip appropriately in restaurants, to understand the unspoken rules of personal space and eye contact that varied from culture to culture. But certain details, especially regarding clothing and personal appearance, were difficult to perfect, particularly in an era before global brands and standardized manufacturing had begun to erase some of the distinctions between national styles. Soviet suits, even when made to mimic American styles, were constructed using European tailoring traditions that dated back generations, traditions so deeply ingrained in the craftsmen who made them that deviation felt unnatural, almost impossible. A Soviet tailor, even one trying to recreate an American garment, would instinctively use the techniques he had been taught from his first days as an apprentice, the button stitching method passed down from his master, the seam finishing techniques that his hands knew without conscious thought, the precise measurements and proportions that differed subtly but distinctly from American methods. The difference wasn't about quality, Muller added, leaning forward with his elbows on the table. Soviet tailoring was often excellent, sometimes superior to mass-produced American garments in terms of hand finishing and attention to detail. But it was different, marked by a set of cultural assumptions and traditions that no amount of training could fully erase. It was like an accent, Harrison said, a comparison that made Samuel nod in understanding. Someone could learn to speak English perfectly, with flawless grammar and extensive vocabulary, but often there would still be something in the rhythm or intonation that marked them as a non-native speaker, something so subtle that most listeners couldn't identify it, but could somehow sense it. The agents asked Samuel detailed questions about what he had observed, and Samuel found himself slipping into the role of expert witness, explaining the nuances of his craft to men who listened with intense concentration and asked surprisingly knowledgeable follow-up questions. They wanted to know everything about Thompson's appearance, his mannerisms, his speech patterns, his behavior in the shop. They asked about the fabric quality, which Samuel described as excellent European wool, probably British or perhaps Italian, with a hand and drape that was characteristic of continental mills. They asked about the construction methods, and Samuel explained the French seams in detail, how they encased the raw edges of fabric in a double fold that created a clean, durable finish that was more time-consuming than American methods, but also more refined. He noted that the jacket's shoulder padding was constructed in a particular way that was common in Eastern European tailoring, with a more structured canvas that created a squarer, more military silhouette than the softer, more natural American shoulder line that had become fashionable in the post-war years. The trouser waistband, Samuel pointed out, had curtain hooks rather than the suspender buttons common on American trousers, another subtle European characteristic that most people would never notice, but that spoke volumes to someone who understood clothing construction. Even the way the pockets were set, the angle of the welt and the depth of the opening, followed European rather than American conventions. Individually, each of these details might be explained away as personal preference or the work of an eccentric tailor, but taken together, they painted a picture of a garment that was fundamentally European despite any labels or claims to American manufacture. It was like a forgery, Samuel said, thinking of the art authentication cases he sometimes read about in the newspaper. A skilled forger might copy every visible element of a painting perfectly, but would sometimes make small mistakes in technique or materials that an expert could identify, revealing the fraud beneath the surface appearance. Harrison and Muller were impressed by Samuel's eye for detail and his ability to articulate what he had observed. They explained their plan. When Thompson returned for his fitting, Samuel should proceed exactly as he normally would, giving no indication that anything was amiss. The agents would have surveillance teams positioned around the shop to observe Thompson's arrival and departure, to follow him and identify his contacts and residence. They would also install a small microphone in the fitting room, hidden in a light fixture, to record any conversation. Samuel would try to engage Thompson in casual conversation, asking questions that might reveal more about his background and activities without arousing suspicion. The day of Thompson's appointment arrived with an early spring drizzle that turned the city streets dark and slick. Samuel had barely slept the previous night, running through scenarios in his mind, worrying about what might go wrong. When the bell above his door chimed at precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he nearly jumped despite expecting Thompson's arrival. He forced a welcoming smile and greeted his customer warmly, hanging up the damp overcoat and inviting Thompson to the fitting room. Samuel had prepared the 2 suits with meticulous care, constructing them to his usual exacting standards. Whatever Thompson might be, he was still a customer, and Samuel's professional pride demanded nothing less than his best work. As Thompson tried on the navy dinner suit, Samuel made the usual adjustments, marking places where small alterations were needed. The conversation flowed easily, with Thompson complimenting the quality of Samuel's work and asking knowledgeable questions about the construction. Samuel mentioned casually that he had been trained in Vienna, and Thompson expressed admiration for European tailoring traditions. As they talked, Samuel gently probed with questions that the agents had suggested. Where in Chicago did Thompson's business operate? What industry was he in? How often did he travel to New York? Thompson's answers were smooth and detailed, almost too detailed, as if he had rehearsed them extensively. He described an import-export business specializing in industrial equipment, a plausible cover that would explain international contacts and frequent travel. But when Samuel asked specific questions about Chicago neighborhoods and landmarks, having spent a week studying maps and guides the agents had provided, Thompson's answers became slightly vague, general observations that could have come from guidebooks rather than lived experience. The fitting concluded without incident, and Samuel told Thompson that the suits would be ready for final pickup in 1 week. Thompson paid the balance in cash again, shook Samuel's hand, and departed into the rainy afternoon. Samuel stood motionless for a long moment after the door closed, his heart pounding, wondering if he had done enough, if his acting had been convincing, if Thompson had suspected anything. Within minutes, Harrison appeared through the back door, his face grim but determined. The surveillance had worked. Thompson had been followed to an apartment building in Brooklyn, and agents were now working to identify all the building's residents and Thompson's specific apartment. Over the next several days, a complex investigation unfolded. The Federal Bureau of Investigation discovered that Robert Thompson was indeed a false identity, constructed with considerable skill, but not quite perfect enough to withstand intense scrutiny. The real Robert Thompson had died as an infant in Illinois 30 years earlier, and Soviet intelligence had appropriated his identity, creating a backstory and documentation that would hold up to casual inspection, but crumbled under detailed investigation. The apartment in Brooklyn was surveilled around the clock, and agents observed Thompson meeting with several other individuals, including a man who worked as a translator at the United Nations and a woman employed by a defense contractor with access to classified information. The decision was made to allow the investigation to continue rather than making immediate arrests. The Federal Bureau of Investigation wanted to map out the entire network, to identify as many members as possible before moving. Samuel's role was to remain normal, to complete the suits and have Thompson return one final time for pickup. This final visit would be crucial, as the agents hoped to plant a tracking device in one of the suits, a small radio transmitter that would allow them to monitor Thompson's movements more closely. When Thompson returned for the final pickup, Samuel was ready. The suits fit beautifully, and Thompson was clearly pleased with the quality of the work. As Samuel wrapped the garments in tissue paper and placed them in garment bags, he managed to activate the small device that had been sewn into the lining of the Navy suit, pressing it in a way that engaged the battery. Thompson paid with cash one final time, thanked Samuel for his excellent craftsmanship, and mentioned that he would certainly return for future tailoring needs. Samuel smiled and said he looked forward to serving him again, knowing that Thompson would almost certainly never walk freely through his door again. The Federal Bureau of Investigation continued their surveillance for another 2 months, patiently documenting meetings, photographing contacts, intercepting communications. The tracking device in Thompson's suit proved invaluable, leading agents to dead drops, safe houses, and clandestine meeting locations throughout New York and New Jersey. The investigation revealed a network of 11 Soviet intelligence officers and American collaborators, one of the most significant penetrations of Soviet espionage operations in the United States during that period. In April of 1957, coordinated raids across New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut resulted in the arrest of 9 individuals. Thompson, whose real name was determined to be Alexei Volkov, was arrested in his Brooklyn apartment, along with encrypted communication equipment, false identity documents, and over $50,000 in cash. The translator from the United Nations was identified as Vladimir Karpov, a lieutenant in Soviet military intelligence. The woman from the defense contractor, Patricia Morrison, was a naturalized American citizen who had been recruited while studying in France 10 years earlier and had been passing information about missile guidance systems to her Soviet handlers. The arrests made headlines across the country. The case was referred to in newspapers as the Madison Avenue spy ring, though few details were released publicly due to national security concerns. Samuel Goldstein's name was never mentioned in press reports. The Federal Bureau of Investigation insisted on protecting his identity, both for his safety and to preserve his potential usefulness in future cases. Samuel received a private commendation letter from Director J. Edgar Hoover himself, thanking him for his patriotism and service to his country. The letter, which Samuel kept in a locked drawer for the rest of his life, meant more to him than any amount of money could have. The trial of the captured spies stretched over several months. Volkov, Karpov, and 3 others were convicted of espionage and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. In a subsequent prisoner exchange, they were eventually returned to the Soviet Union in trade for captured American intelligence officers. Patricia Morrison cooperated with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence, providing valuable information about Soviet recruitment methods and communication procedures. 2 members of the network who had been identified but not arrested had fled the country, presumably warned by some signal within the spy ring that the investigation was closing in. For Samuel Goldstein, life returned to a semblance of normalcy, though the experience had changed him in ways both subtle and profound. He continued operating his tailoring shop, continuing to serve the businessmen and professionals of Manhattan with the same meticulous care and attention to detail that had made his reputation. But now, he looked at every customer with slightly different eyes, noticing details that he had previously considered merely matters of professional interest. He became, unofficially, a consultant to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, meeting occasionally with agents to share his observations about clothing construction, to identify the national origin of garments, to spot the kinds of details that might reveal a false identity. The Cold War continued its tense standoff between democratic capitalism and Soviet communism, played out in proxy conflicts, nuclear brinkmanship, and the shadowy world of espionage, where Samuel Goldstein had unexpectedly found himself a player. The Committee for State Security and the Central Intelligence Agency continued their chess game of agents and double agents, of information and disinformation, knowing that the smallest details could mean the difference between success and catastrophic failure. Soviet tailors, learning from the Volkov case, began training more carefully in American construction methods, trying to eliminate the cultural tells that had betrayed their agents. American counterintelligence, in turn, found new ways to identify foreign operatives, always in a dance of adaptation and counter-adaptation. In the years that followed, Samuel trained several younger tailors, passing on not just the technical skills of his craft, but also the deeper knowledge of how clothing revealed culture and origin. He taught them to notice button stitching patterns, seam constructions, thread weights, fabric textures. Some of his apprentices never knew the full significance of these lessons, thinking them merely examples of Samuel's exacting standards. But a few, those who seemed particularly observant and discreet, were quietly informed of how such knowledge could serve purposes beyond the creation of fine garments. Samuel Goldstein lived to the age of 83, passing away peacefully in 1989, the same year that the Berlin Wall fell and the Cold War began its final chapter. His obituary in the New York Times described him as a master tailor and beloved member of the Manhattan business community, making no mention of his role in uncovering Soviet espionage. Only a handful of people knew the full story, and they kept the secret out of respect for Samuel's wishes that his life be remembered for his craft, not for a moment of historical significance that he had always considered simply a matter of doing his duty. The suits that Samuel had made for Alexei Volkov were eventually returned to him by the Federal Bureau of Investigation after the trial concluded. Samuel examined them carefully, appreciating the quality of his own work, even as he felt a complex mixture of pride and sadness. He donated them to a charitable organization that provided professional clothing to men re-entering the workforce after incarceration, reasoning that good suits deserved to serve good purposes regardless of who had originally commissioned them. The tracking device was removed first, of course, and presumably found its way to some Federal Bureau of Investigation storage facility, or perhaps the Intelligence Museum that Samuel had heard existed but never seen. The story of how a tailor identified a Soviet spy by a single button became something of a legend within the intelligence community, told in training sessions as an example of how the smallest details matter in the world of espionage. The term tradecraft, meaning the specific skills and techniques used by intelligence operatives, came to include not just communication methods and surveillance techniques, but also an understanding of cultural details like clothing construction. American intelligence officers operating abroad learned to pay meticulous attention to their appearance, not just buying local clothing, but having it altered by local tailors to ensure that every detail, down to the button stitching, matched local practices. For Soviet intelligence, the Volkov case was a harsh lesson in the importance of absolute authenticity. The Committee for State Security increased its training in what it called cultural immersion, requiring illegal agents, those operating without diplomatic cover, to spend years studying every aspect of their target culture. Agents destined for American operations were sent to special training facilities where they lived entirely as Americans, wearing American clothes made by American tailors, eating American food, watching American television, reading American newspapers until every gesture and habit became second nature. But despite these efforts, small mistakes continued to occur because culture runs deeper than conscious knowledge, embedded in unconscious habits and assumptions that even intensive training sometimes failed to overcome. The parallels between Samuel Goldstein's story and the broader narrative of the Cold War are striking. Both involved competing systems, democracy versus communism, each convinced of its own righteousness and the other's malevolence. Both involved ordinary people drawn into extraordinary circumstances, asked to make choices about loyalty, courage, and sacrifice. Both involved the tension between surface appearances and hidden realities, where nothing was quite what it seemed and trust was a luxury few could afford. And both ultimately came down to details, to careful observation, to the accumulation of small pieces of information that, assembled correctly, revealed the larger truth. The Madison Avenue spy ring, as it came to be known within intelligence circles, represented one of numerous Soviet espionage operations disrupted during the Cold War. But it stood out because of the unusual way it was uncovered, not through electronic intercepts or satellite imagery or information from a defector, but through the trained eye of a tailor who noticed that buttons were sewn on incorrectly. This human element, the importance of individual observation and judgment, remained crucial throughout the Cold War, despite the increasing sophistication of technical intelligence gathering methods. Samuel Goldstein's contribution to American national security was never publicly acknowledged during his lifetime, and he preferred it that way. He had not acted seeking recognition or reward, but simply because he believed it was the right thing to do. He had escaped tyranny once, and had no desire to see it take root in his adopted homeland. His weapon against that threat was not a gun or a cipher or a satellite, but rather the knowledge acquired through decades of careful craftsmanship, the ability to distinguish French button stitching from American, to recognize the subtle markers of origin that others missed. In this, Samuel embodied something essential about the Cold War, that it was ultimately won not just by missiles and spies, but by the countless individual acts of vigilance and courage performed by ordinary people who refused to look away when they noticed something wrong. The Cold War officially ended in 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but its legacy continues to shape international relations and intelligence operations into the 21st century. The techniques of espionage have evolved with technology, incorporating digital surveillance, cyber warfare, and sophisticated electronic intelligence gathering that would have seemed like science fiction to Samuel Goldstein. Yet the fundamental principles remain unchanged. Details still matter, cultural knowledge still matters, human observation and judgment still matter, and sometimes the fate of nations still hinges on someone noticing that a button was sewn on wrong. In the end, Samuel Goldstein's story is about more than espionage or the Cold War. It is about the value of expertise and craftsmanship, about how deep knowledge in any field can become relevant in unexpected ways. It is about the immigrant experience, about how someone who arrived in America with almost nothing was able to contribute something invaluable to his adopted country. It is about duty and courage, about ordinary people who do extraordinary things without seeking glory or recognition. And it is about the power of paying attention, of noticing the details that others miss, of understanding that in a world full of deception and hidden agendas, truth often reveals itself in the smallest and most unexpected ways. The button that betrayed Alexei Volkov was eventually cut from his jacket and preserved as a teaching tool, mounted in a small frame, with a description of its significance. It resided for years in a classified training facility, shown to new intelligence officers as a reminder that their adversaries, no matter how well trained, were still human and therefore fallible. The button itself was unremarkable, a simple horn button of the type found on thousands of suits, but its attachment, those two parallel lines of thread instead of the expected crisscross, made it a symbol of how the smallest oversight can have enormous consequences. Samuel Goldstein never sought to profit from his experience or to make himself a public figure. He remained the quiet, dignified craftsman he had always been, finding satisfaction in his work and in the knowledge that he had served his country well when called upon. His story, told here, represents just one thread in the vast and complex tapestry of the Cold War, but it is a thread that helps us understand the larger pattern, the interplay of individual action and historical forces, of specialized knowledge and national security, of chance and consequence. In the shadow war between superpowers, victory sometimes came from the most unexpected sources. A Viennese tailor working on Madison Avenue who knew that buttons should be sewn on with crossed threads, not parallel ones, and who understood that this small detail might mean the difference between freedom and tyranny. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories, and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.